Howdy YouTube. Yeah, I know it's Halloween and not Christmas, but I got a present anyway. Stick with me and I'll show you how this thing goes from truck to a working tool in the shop. Big tools from companies like Grizly ship via freight services. So that means a big truck that's not going to come up your driveway. I paid $34 extra to get the liftgate service, and boy am I glad I did. The drivers won't always help you get stuff onto your own trailer or truck, but the pallet was a non-standard size and the pallet jack wouldn't work, so this guy was kind enough to lend a hand. I made a nice slow trip up the driveway with the trailer being pulled by the tractor. This is actually sped up 1,500%. Once you get it up there, get it in a nice solid spot and block your trailer so that it doesn't fall over backwards when you disconnect it. In the garage, I tore into the pallet. This was surprisingly easy to do. I don't know how this thing wasn't damaged in transit, as crappy as the pallet turned out to be. Okay, got it all out of the crate except for the fact that it's still sitting on the pallet down here at the bottom. And I need to get it moved from that pallet and onto this mobile base. Problem is, it's just top heavy enough that I'm not comfortable sliding it. It's also not a real smooth surface on this mobile base with all the bolts sticking up. And it's still just a little bit too heavy to manhandle it effectively. I mean, I guess if you had two really strong friends, you could just kind of pick it up by the dust port and the back arm and set it in there. But I'm by myself, so that's not going to work. What I decided to do was hang it from the ceiling. The strapping that holds up the garage door is more than strong enough and well anchored enough to suspend this bandsaw, or at least take most of the weight off of it. So I just have a couple of quick links and a big old turnbuckle up there. I'm going to be able to screw down, lift this thing up just enough. I don't need it 8 feet in the air, just enough to be able to slide the pallet out and slide the mobile base under it. So the good news is that this system works really, really well. It's really easy to lift even this 300-pound bandsaw with that turnbuckle. The bad news is that it's completely unnerving. The framing creaks and the band creaks and everything. And then you find out that your turnbuckle wasn't quite long enough and you still have to put it down the last couple of inches by hand using a 2x4 as a lever. Well, first snag, but this one is going to be relatively easy to overcome. The bottom door doesn't clear the bolts on the mobile base. And if it did, it wouldn't clear this riser for the caster. So I am going to have to get some 3/4 inch ply and put a riser underneath the entire bandsaw. That's okay. That's going to give me a way to bolt the whole thing together. In the end, it'll probably be a little more weight on the bottom, and the bolts, it'll be more substantial and even sturdier than it is now, but wish somebody at the factory had thought of this. All right, well, door or no door, I managed to dig the accessories out of the bottom of the bandsaw and put my guard adjustment gear on here. Unlike a lot of bandsaws where this is a slide it up and down yourself, on the Grizly bandsaw, this has a lock, which is in the back, pinches it down, and then the adjustment is made with this geared hand wheel. It has a scale on here that you can read out the height of the guard. Remains to be seen how useful that is. There's a definite time penalty. It takes a whole lot longer to put this thing up and down than one that you would just slide, but that's, I guess, the trade-off for precision that we'll see if I ever use it. So the bearings come close, but not exactly where you want them. And they also could use just one little drop of lubrication. There's a definite belt and suspenders philosophy on these things. There's an Allen key set screw here that holds the bearing block in place and a threaded adjustment on the back. I'm using a business card to set the depth. The side bearings are rollers as well. Another pair of index cards sets them right about where I want them. Now the trick to this is to apply enough pressure to it, but without deflecting the blade sideways. You have to put pressure on each one of them the same. Okay, with all the guides set, it's time to run this wheel around by hand and see if I hear any odd noises and see how well the blade tracks. Well, that there's not bad. Right in the center of the tire, right where I want it to be. Doubt I could adjust it any better. The saw comes pre-wired for 220 volts, and eventually I'm going to hook it up to a 220 circuit. But for right now, 110 is what I have available. In fact, I have a 30 amp 110 outlet. It's what the welder is plugged into. It's pretty simple. You're just taking apart this red and white pair over here. Then the red goes in with our black wires. And all the light wires go together. Whites, grays, yellows, those kinds of things. What we've really done by making this change is we've taken two sets of coils that go around this motor, and they used to be in series for the 220 volts. We just put them in parallel for 110. And be sure and replace your electrical tape with electrical tape. Don't go sticking masking tape, duct tape, gaffer's tape, scotch tape, or any other thing you have laying around on here. All right, one last thing to do before we give this thing a test run, plug it in, and that is to make sure that the blade has sufficient tension on it. If I push on this blade hard enough to poke someone and get in trouble, it moves, I don't know, maybe a half an inch. That's a little bit much. I'm going to come up here and tension this thing just a little bit more. And that looks a whole lot better. Okay, so we're ready for the first power on. I'm going to lock the blade guide all the way down so I have as little blade as possible exposed. And close the top. Cross your fingers. I'm going to turn it on, and then I'm going to turn it off. Nothing blew up. Unlike all good imports, you're going to get to spend some quality time with the mineral spirits, getting the degreaser off all of the unpainted surfaces. Fortunately, on a bandsaw, that's pretty much just the cast iron tabletop. All right, and pretty much the instant that it is dry from the mineral spirits, I'm going to hit it with some of this T9 bow shield, because once you take that grease off of here, this bare polished cast iron will rust like almost instantly. So don't wait. Wax, whatever you're going to do, but protect your cast iron as soon as you clean it off. Otherwise, you'll be doing it again. The directions say you're going to need 2 people to put the table on here, but I found it was easy enough to hold it with one hand and start the screws with the other. It's pretty well balanced on the trunnions. Just be careful when you're tightening them down. The trunnions then adjust to get yourself nice and square to the blade. All right, I got the saw moved back here into the corner of the shop so I can get it hooked up to the dust collector. Eventually, obviously, I'm going to have to do some piping and get some longer hose or something, I don't know. But next steps on the saw itself are to attach the fence system. That starts with bolting this rear rail onto the back of the table. The front rail goes on similarly, only this time it's 10mm hex nuts with lock washers instead of the Allen keys. If you remember to get the paint out of the threads before you put this thing on here, you can get the bolts in mostly by hand. If not, you'll be putting ratcheting box end wrenches on your Christmas list. Now obviously you want these bolts snug, but remember, you got a steel bolt pressing an aluminum fence into a cast iron tabletop and threads. So don't go crazy with it. The fence itself comes pretty much assembled. You have to screw this handle onto the locking mechanism, and this foot screws onto the bottom at the end. This is what rides across that rail that we put on the back. There's a jam nut to keep this locked in place. I'm going to screw it all the way in, and then I'll adjust it for a nice flat fit of the fence once I get it on here. And if you have feeler gauges, you can get this exact, but eyeball's good enough too. The last 2 setup operations with respect to the table, and they have to do with making sure that it is square to the blade, essentially in all 3 dimensions. This dimension towards me is controlled by the trunnions, so that's super easy to adjust. The angle of the table front and back, you want to be perpendicular to the back of the blade is the easiest place to check it. And mine is pretty darn good. I've got, oh gosh, worst case, a 1/64 of an inch gap over this 1 foot distance. Given the fact that the blade moves around a little bit, in fact, if I push it back against the guides, it comes out pretty much dead square. I'm not going to fool with it for that little bit, maybe someday, because to adjust that, what you have to do is you have to shim where the table attaches to the trunnions. And I don't honestly have anything thin enough. I would have to get either some aluminum foil or some actual brass shim stock to take care of that little bit of an amount. So that goes on the someday list. The other thing you want to check is the rotational squareness of it. The miter slot needs to be parallel to the blade. And there are a couple of ways to check this. I'm going to just take the sort of the quick and dirty way. I'm going to take this framing square here, and I'm going to pinch it against the blade to get it so that it's, fairly square along the travel of the blade. And I'm going to measure out here, and what I've got is at the end of this square, it's 4 3/4 inches of space. And if I flip this thing over, I do exactly the same operation, I see that I have 4 1/2 inches of space. So the table is cocked just a little bit this way. That's simple enough to fix. I just have to loosen up the bolts that connect this to the trunnion, twist the table 1/8 of an inch, and screw it back down. Moment of truth, YouTube. Got this thing pretty much all set up. Since I had to loosen the bolts anyway to rotate the table to get the miter slot aligned with the blade, I went ahead and stuck some aluminum foil under the front 2 bolts. So I've got it pretty much dead on square in all 3 directions. To be honest with you, the blade that comes with this bandsaw is just kind of so I'm not sure how much real precision on the table matters. I jury-rigged the dust collection, had to steal the 4-inch hoses from both the chop saw and the table saw in order to do it. Definitely going to have to work on that system. All that remains is to grab the safety gear, hit the power switch. Well, what do you know? What was 1 2x4 is now 2 1x4s or something like that. Anyway, it's cut in half-ish. Not bad for a freehand and a first try. For those of you who've not used a bandsaw before, don't expect to get a finished quality cut off of a thing like this, especially not with this wonderful blade that was supplied here. If you're going to resaw big pieces, then you're going to need a pretty coarse blade if you expect to make any time through the wood, and that's going to leave you with something that's going to need to be cleaned up. But the good news is that jointer, planer, hand plane, even sandpaper, if you had to hand sand this, it's not really that much of a chore. So more good news, the dust collection works great. There's obviously some dust here on the top of the table, and there's a little bit of dust underneath on the trunnions and such things, but really, really very minimal when you think about the amount of wood that we cut, knocking that thing down in half. And while I can't get the bottom door all the way open really to show you, I was able to peek in there, and there is almost 0 dust inside the saw. There's not a speck on the tire or on the blade, a little bit on the brushes, not too much, but basically the 2 dust ports on here seem to be strategically placed well enough that at least the inside of this is not gonna have to be cleaned out. I still have a couple more things to do to get the thing 100% operational. I got to line up the fence for the blade drift, which doesn't seem too bad, but it's not, perfectly square. No bandsaw is. I'm going to play with the tension just a little bit, see what a little bit tighter, a little bit looser does for the blade and how it cuts and how it tracks. But mostly, I think this is pretty good where it is. And obviously, one of these days, I'm going to have to do something about the mobile base so I can get the bottom door open so that I can change this blade. So one cut does not a test make. I'm not going to tell you whether I'm totally happy with this thing or not until I have put it through its paces and done a couple projects with it. I got to tell you that goofy stickers aside, my initial impressions are pretty good, and given the sale and the free shipping, you really can't argue with the price for a machine this size. Well, for those of you who are wondering, this did come with a miter gauge. It has adjustable stops for 90 and 45 degrees on either side. So at some point, once I'm sure I've got the blade tensioned and tracking the way I want it to, I have to go in here and fine tune the miter gauge to be exactly lined up. But those details are going to have to wait for another day. I'm going to quit while I'm ahead at this point. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, stay safe, YouTube.